Welcome to Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean, Part 7. In this section, we move roughly to around about the 1600s, where Britain come into the fray, setting up colony in the Caribbean. We also cover what the natives may have thought about this, because it would have been anguish for them, right? Next, we just break down what the plantation system would have looked like in its generic or embryonic stage. So let's get into this. Let's read on. The first Europeans to settle in the Caribbean were virtually lighthouse men, left on an island for reasons of clemency against the obvious threat of rival European entities, security of imperial assets, and to establish a solid supply chain of continuous output. Naturistic way of life or regard for natives would have held little courtly concern over the attainment honouring the contract of patriotism as well as boundless individual bounty. The Europeans, at first most probably being outnumbered, must have had the distracting thought of being seen to plunder right in full view of the native command. This is precisely why the question must be asked: what would have been the native thoughts from a panoramic scale? Right, so into the 1600s, the Europeans have, beyond expedition, they've now set up colonies pretty much across every single island of the Caribbean and also probably the South Americas and the American mainland, right? And Britain's now here after Spain and looking to put their flag in the ground. And, it's happening all over the Caribbean. The Caribs, or the Kalinago as they're known now, and the Taino are now subjugated, are now sort of in guerrilla warfare, but have been pretty much suppressed and almost eliminated, yeah? Apart from a few that sort of are left over and have been used as slaves if they've been caught, yeah? Obviously, what would they have thought? What would have been their feelings? Just watching their land be decimated and be changed and be industrialized. They would have they would be obviously at their lowest ebb. They would have seen like thousands of their fellow counterparts fall by the wayside, and they would have seen this new population of white, and then eventually a black population just literally take over and colonize what is rightfully theirs. Work which is carried out under plunder, applied grievance against the force of a slave master's desensitized domination which falls under remit of exploitation was next. Meanwhile, the first missionaries were dispatched as a means of incorporating the natives. A clash of civilizations would see that the natives were starved of choice. They would have been accosted with the stark contrast of making a stand, running away, or accepting this new way of life. Simultaneously, the Atlantic breeze, now carrying New World disease, surfing the waves, was a weapon of fumigation that secured most of the America's indigenous civilizations' extermination, more than initial slavery or colonization could ever match. Disease saw that within 2 to 3 decades the biologically unguarded indigenous had almost been wiped out. Each tribe became a minority close to erasure on their own landmass. This solitary factor ushered the vacant accommodation needed for total colonization. Conquistador campaign of enrichment on behalf of European aristocracy would have been a collection of subjugated indigenous and European settlers. To meet what may have been overloading demand, the attempt to attract a European workforce would have been high on the list of agenda. Failure to secure or transport what would have been European peasantry as sacrificial manpower quickly ran its course of sustainability. Within years, physical exertion fed merchant trade into establishment in full presence of the natives with no consultation. The indigenous were noted to be civilized contrary to popular belief, but were clashing against the socio-political order, being sufficiently hardened to 4,000 years of interaction, cultural exchange, and management of existential threat combativeness. The introduction of the plantation system was at its structural breeding ground. So there we have it. The Europeans have staked a claim on every single island. They've at first tried to transport European peasantry, most notably from places like Spain and Portugal, but also like Ireland's unruly, and also like England. But obviously that didn't come to real fruition. They couldn't get the numbers for love nor money, which is where the West Africans come into the fray and come into the picture, which we'll speak about a little later on in the series. The indigenous would also be part of the brigade of plantation workers, and what we're going to move on to now is just give you an example of what happened or what was happening via the island of Barbados and its story in the beginning. Barbados, for example, became the first major colonial industrial British outpost in the Caribbean. Barbados was the heart and the blueprint of the plantation system that would be franchised throughout the empire's expansion, that would go on to claim regency, peaking over an astonishing 1 in 4 of the planet's subjects. The plantation system's generic mainframe was outlined along the establishment of a small elite group at the pinnacle that would rule with no patience for insubordination. Next, there would be servants, followed by the slave master's cannon fodder, the workers. Major aristocratic families of England predominantly would go on to divide Barbados amongst themselves as free agricultural land. Slave masters from the ruling elites back in Europe were to scramble for what would become Britain's most valuable colony. A windward island, such as Barbados, must have been run as if it was a well-oiled machine with perishable slave manpower that could perform tirelessly under the hot tropical sun, successfully amounting to Barbados becoming known as Little England. Right, so there we have it. Like Barbados, which is where one half of my family comes from, in the Caribbean, was Britain's official first colony of the Caribbean, probably the Americas too, if you discount America, right, or the USA. And they implemented the plantation system that was already running in the Dominican Republic, but transferred it to and implemented it to Barbados. They then obviously will go on to introduce the black African chattel slave because they never had the numbers from Britain. They never had enough. They got like thousands of Irish before the black African Caribbean arrived, or black African, someone like myself arrived, but they couldn't hold them down to full slavery because they were under contract and they were free after their contract expired, although they were pretty much treated like slaves up until that point. So they went and obviously looked for numbers to fill the vacancies because the business was there. You can't shy away from it. They needed the numbers. They went and got them from somewhere, right? But whether it was right or not, we'll speak about that later. But Barbados was pretty much the headquarters of the Caribbean for the British Empire, and is where it was the most fruitful island for them by none for the 1600s. Obviously, places like Trinidad that were fought for and Jamaica that were fought for may have overtook in the impending centuries, but up until that point, Little England, as it's become known, and it's still known to this day as a slang term, is Barbados. which is why sometimes, out of the Caribbean, you've heard like a loud voice for reparations coming out of Barbados. I've seen the Prime Minister, her name eludes me right now, but that's as to the reason why, because it was the first colony going back 300 years that supplied Britain and pretty much gave Britain what it is, Not what it is, but it was a massive part in the colonial cog, and it touches someone, especially if you're from that background. But as I say, history's history, and what's eventually done is done. Now, obviously, alongside what was going on, the natives would have been depleted and decimated by now, if they didn't escape to the mountains of Dominica. They were rounded up and obviously amalgamated into slavery, and would have assimilated with the black African population. So their genes would be mixed with ours, a lot of them. Must also go on to add that Britain, they went on at this stage to have under subjugation or under colonial rule 1 in 4 of the subjects of Earth, which is astounding. Whichever way you look at it, it's an astonishing feat, and which is why English is so widely spoken across all continents, right? On top of that, the plantation system, very simple in framework, but very fruitful. You had the white plantation slave masters, I'd like to call them, at the top. These were major aristocratic families of Britain of the time. Obviously, their ancestors are still here, and you could say bear fruit, but they were nothing to do with it. It was their ancestor that's been not here no more, so I don't hold nothing against them personally, but their initial wealth would have been off the back of a slave of my diaspora, so it is sensitive sometimes. And in the middle you had people like, you had the slave drivers, you had servants and people of that nature that sometimes were white European in peasantry, or slaves that were Uncle Toms or whatever. They would obviously fill in those positions, and then at the bottom, the workers in the fields were the blacks or the Africans that would soon to come, or the subjugated Taino or Kalinaga or Segueyo as it were back then, Now, Barbados, I would say is quite popular in terms of travel amongst white British people. It's known as Little England. There's a reason why, and I guess I've just defined as to the reason why. They've got a steep history going back 300 years of connection and colonisation with Barbados, and that's why it's known as Little England, And also on top of that, Barbados, again, I may have said this before, if you know what you're doing coming from Africa, it's the first island that's met upon meeting the trade winds of the Caribbean, or the Atlantic trade winds that bring you into the Caribbean. So most probably it's the first island that slaves were offloaded from or dismounted from, and then obviously spread amongst the island chain, and eventually obviously the rest of the slaves were probably let off into the American mainland. So a massive history, and you could say is the main starting place of the transatlantic slave movement in the Caribbean. Anyway, that brings this episode to a conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're enjoying the series. I hope it's going down well. I hope to get some feedback. No doubt, I can feel a little bit of feedback publicly, but I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing. So next, I think we're going to sort of go into more about what it was like regarding slavery, and just look at the business around it, Anyway, once again, hope this message reaches you well. Deliver this message straight to your heart, because it's from mine. All right, absolute love to all. bless. Love, one.